On a Tuesday afternoon, a landscaping crew finished reducing 8 years of carefully cultivated hedge to 14-inch stumps, loaded the chipped material into a trailer, and drove away. I watched it happen in real time on my phone, through a camera I had helped my neighbor install 3 weeks earlier, because she had told me what she believed was coming, and I had believed her. Alina Marsh was not someone who said things she didn't mean or believed things without reason. By the time the crew pulled out at 4 in the afternoon, she had already won. She just didn't have the wall yet. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 50 years old, a licensed civil engineer with 18 years of experience in structural design and site infrastructure. I've lived next door to Alina Marsh on Millbrook Drive in a planned HOA community in Central Tennessee for 6 years.
Alina is 61, a retired federal appellate judge who left the bench 4 years ago and has spent those 4 years doing 3 things. Tending her garden with the same methodical attention she once brought to every case she decided, reading extensively in the history of property law, which is her scholarly interest, and maintaining the private hedge she started from nursery stock in her 3rd year on Millbrook Drive. By its 8th year, that hedge was 11 feet tall, uniformly dense, and shaped with the precision of someone who works from a written plan and checks the plan against the result every year. She had drawn the planting layout herself on graph paper. She had specified the interval between each plant, the mature canopy target width, and the annual shaping schedule she intended to follow. 8 years of that schedule had produced something that was genuinely beautiful and genuinely functional, a dense visual screen running the full length of her western property line. I am telling this story rather than Alina because she asked me to. Not because she couldn't tell it herself. She is entirely capable of telling it. She told it to 3 attorneys, 2 engineering consultants, the HOA board in a formal proceeding that lasted 2 hours, and a circuit court judge in a 40-minute oral argument the judge later described in her written opinion as the most precisely organized presentation she had received from a self-represented party in 11 years on the bench. Alina asked me to tell this version because she said I would tell the engineering parts correctly, and she would rather have the engineering parts told correctly than tell them herself and risk imprecision in the technical description. Those are her words. I am honoring them. The western property line where the hedge grew was adjacent to the lot owned by Patricia Holden, who had moved to the neighborhood 22 months ago. Patricia was 55, a former real estate developer from Charlotte with strong opinions about what residential property should look like and a specific objection to Alina's hedge. She expressed that objection first in a direct conversation with Alina, describing the hedge as creating an oppressive atmosphere. Then in a formal HOA complaint, citing community standards on plantings. Then in 2 additional complaints when the first was dismissed. Then through her position on the HOA Architectural Committee, which she had joined after moving in, and which, 7 months after her arrival, produced an informal guidance document on planting heights. Not a CC&R provision, not a binding requirement, an informal guidance document created by a committee on which Patricia herself sat. Using that document, Patricia pushed for a violation finding against Alina's hedge on the grounds that it exceeded the community's informal guidance on planting height. The board voted 4-1 to uphold the finding with a 60-day compliance order. Alina contested every step of this through every procedural avenue available to her. She filed a formal objection. She requested a full board hearing. She presented at that hearing with the hedge's complete 8-year history, documentation that the prior board had expressed no concern about it for 8 years, the full CC&R text, which specified no height limits for privacy plantings, and a written analysis demonstrating that the informal guidance document had no binding authority under the governing documents. The board upheld the violation anyway. Alina called me that evening. She said, "They voted to uphold it." I said, "What's your plan?" She said, "I'm filing for declaratory judgment in the circuit court. I'm also installing cameras." I said, "I'll help with the cameras." We installed 4 of them the following Saturday. I handled the mounting and network configuration. Alina handled the positioning, which she determined by walking every angle and confirming full coverage before approving each location.
The following week, she filed her declaratory judgment petition, largely herself because she had spent 11 years drafting legal documents as a judge and understood their structure thoroughly. Her attorney's review produced 3 suggested additions and no suggested deletions, which Alina noted to me with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had held up under professional scrutiny. The petition asked the circuit court to declare that Alina's hedge did not violate the CC&Rs, that the informal guidance document had no binding authority, and that the board's violation finding was therefore void. It also included a request for injunctive relief, preventing enforcement while the petition was pending. The court scheduled an injunction hearing for 3 weeks out. Patricia Holden had a different timeline.
The crew arrived at 9:14 in the morning, 7 days before the scheduled injunction hearing. They worked for 6 hours. The chipping was finished by 3:40 in the afternoon. They left by 4. Alina came home from a meeting with her attorney, reviewed her camera footage, and called me. She said, "They cut it." I said, "I'm watching the footage." She said, "During pending proceedings?" I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." I said, "Good." She said, "Now we have contempt." I called her attorney while Alina reviewed the footage herself. He said the hedge had been destroyed during pending court proceedings, after both the petition and the injunction application had been properly filed and served. I confirmed it was 7 days before the injunction hearing. He said the service documentation was clear. Patricia Holden and the board had known proceedings were pending. He said this was contempt of the judicial process. He filed an emergency motion that evening. The emergency hearing was the following morning. Alina presented the camera footage personally. The circuit court judge, the Honorable Patricia Sims, reviewed the footage alongside the complete timeline: petition filing date, injunction application date, service documentation, and hedge destruction date. She looked at Patricia Holden's attorney, a man named Douglas Fenn, and said, "What is your client's explanation for the timing?" Douglas said the board had believed the compliance period continued to run during the petition's pendency and had acted to enforce before the injunction could prevent it. Judge Sims said, "Your client deliberately accelerated enforcement specifically because the injunction application was pending and they believed they had a closing window." Douglas said the board had considered it a compliance timeline matter. Judge Sims said, "I consider it a deliberate circumvention of the judicial process. That is not a compliance timeline matter." She found Patricia Holden and the HOA board in contempt of court. She ordered the board to pay Alina's attorney fees for the emergency proceeding. She set the underlying declaratory judgment case for expedited hearing. And she noted in the record that the deliberate acceleration of enforcement during pending proceedings was a factor the court would consider in assessing damages. The declaratory judgment hearing was 6 weeks later. Alina argued her own case, with her attorney at the table for consultation. She presented the CC&R text and its absence of height specifications, the informal guidance document and its procedural history, specifically when it was created and by whom, the 8-year history of the hedge, the prior board's complete absence of any concern over those 8 years, and the formal analysis of the guidance document's lack of binding authority. Judge Sims ruled for Alina on every count. The informal guidance document had no binding authority. The board's violation finding was void. The hedge, which no longer existed, had not violated any enforceable community standard. Then came the damages phase. That was where I came in professionally. Alina asked me to prepare an engineering assessment of the hedge's value. She trusted my technical work, and she wanted the assessment prepared by someone who understood structural and site engineering and could speak to the hedge's role as site infrastructure, not merely as decorative planting. I prepared a 12-page assessment. It valued the private hedge at $39,000 based on 4 components. First, the replacement cost of equivalent mature hedging stock from comparable nursery sources, which I researched through 3 botanical nurseries, including Alina's own. Second, the installation labor for replanting at the correct specifications, calculated from current landscape contractor rates. Third, the growth time value, the economic value of 8 years of established root structure and canopy density that cannot be replaced, regardless of immediate material cost.
I calculated this using an accepted horticultural valuation methodology that assigns annual value to established plant growth. Fourth, the loss of function value. The economic impact of the visual screen being absent during the 6 to 8 years required for replacement growth to reach comparable density. The total was $39,000. Elena reviewed the assessment and said it was methodologically sound. Her attorney said it was the strongest horticultural valuation he had seen in a civil claim. Douglas Fenn reviewed it on behalf of Patricia Holden and did not challenge the methodology. The settlement demand covered the full scope, $39,000 in hedge damages, Elena's attorney fees from the contempt proceeding, and the full declaratory judgment litigation. My fees for the engineering assessment, compensatory damages for 22 months of documented harassment through the complaint process, and punitive damages that Elena's attorney argued were clearly warranted by the contempt finding. Total demand, $67,000. Patricia Holden's insurance carrier had become involved from the moment of the contempt finding. They reviewed the case and apparently concluded that a matter in which their insured had deliberately accelerated enforcement to circumvent a pending injunction was not one they preferred to litigate to conclusion. They authorized settlement close to the full demand. The final settlement was $61,000. Patricia paid $12,000 personally. The board's insurance covered $22,000. Patricia's insurance covered $27,000. The personal component was something Elena had specifically insisted upon in the negotiation. She said that consequences which are entirely absorbed by insurance are not fully felt by the person who created them. Patricia Holden resigned from the HOA Architectural Committee the week after the settlement was executed. The board sent Elena a formal written apology and a resolution withdrawing all enforcement actions related to her western property line. Now I need to tell you what Elena built. The day after the settlement was finalized, she came to my door at 8 in the morning with a cup of coffee and a notebook. She said, "I need your help designing something." We sat at my kitchen table. She opened the notebook. She had been thinking about what came next since the day after the destruction, with the same rigor she brought to everything she considered carefully, which meant she had read about it, researched it, consulted sources she trusted, and arrived at a position she was prepared to defend. She said, "I'm not going to replant along that line." I said, "What are you going to plant?" She said, "Nothing, not along that line." I said, "Then tell me what you're going to build." She said, "A wall, but not the wall you're thinking of." I looked at her notebook. She had a sketch. It was not the simple concrete block wall I had designed in other situations. It was something more considered. She had drawn a wall with integrated recessed niches at regular intervals, each niche approximately 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep. And in each niche, she had drawn a potted specimen from the botanical collection she had been building through her scholarly work for 11 years. She said, "I want a gallery wall." I said, "Tell me what that means." She said, "I want a wall that is a display surface for botanical specimens. I want each niche to be a display position. I want the wall to be the thing that was not there before. Not a replacement for the hedge, but something the hedge could never have been." I studied the sketch for a moment. Then I asked, "What do you want viewers to see?" She said, "I want Patricia Holden to look at this wall from her property and see the botanical collection that my hedge used to hide. I want her to see it every day. I want the consequence of what she did to be that I now have something more visible and more permanent than what she destroyed." I said, "That is a specific design intent." She said, "I am a former federal judge. I have spent my life thinking about what consequences are meant to accomplish. This wall will accomplish what I intend it to." I designed it over 2 weeks. The structural specification was standard for this kind of installation. Concrete block cores with rebar reinforcement, a 36-inch footing, 10 feet of height with a county permit required above 8 feet. The distinction was in the face. On the interior side, facing Elena's property, the wall had the integrated recessed niches at 8-foot intervals, cast concrete with drainage at the base, and a mounting plate for each botanical specimen.
On the exterior side, facing Patricia's property, the wall had a smooth sand stucco finish in a warm terracotta color that Alina had chosen because it matched the clay pots she used for her collection. 12 niches along the full 306 linear feet of the western property line. Each niche lit from above by a small LED strip mounted in the niche soffit, solar-powered, on a timer that illuminated the specimens from dusk to 11 at night. Alina's botanical collection, 11 years of careful curation, would be visible in their illuminated niches from Patricia's property every single evening. The permit was approved in 16 days. Construction took 5. On a Saturday, the wall was complete. That evening, Alina moved the first 12 specimens from her greenhouse to the 12 niches, selected for their visual interest at that time of year and for their relevance to the reference work she was currently doing on native Tennessee flora. She positioned each plant with the attention she had given every plant decision in her life. When the solar lights came on at dusk, I stood in Alina's backyard and looked at the wall. 12 illuminated niches, botanical specimens in terracotta pots against sand stucco, 10 feet high, lit warmly in the Tennessee evening, visible over the wall from Patricia's side as a warm, steady glow that would be the first thing Patricia saw when she looked west from her windows after dark. Alina stood next to me. She said, "It is correct." I said the niche proportions worked well and the illumination angle was good. She said, "I mean it is correct as a consequence." I said, "Yes." She said, "She destroyed my hedge because she found it oppressive. She found 8 years of careful growth oppressive." She looked at the wall for a moment. "What she has now is something that will be here when she has moved, when I have gone, when everyone involved in this situation is finished with it." I said, "The footing is at 36 inches. She said, "I know. You told me the specification." I said, "It will be here for a considerable time." She said, "Yes, I intend it to be." We stood in the backyard until the lights had been running long enough to confirm the timer was working correctly. Then, Alina went inside to continue the botanical reference work she had been doing. 12 specimens that would eventually be part of a field guide to native Tennessee flora. And I went home. 2 weeks later, a woman who lived 2 doors down knocked on Alina's door. She had seen the wall from the street. She wanted to know who had designed it and what the illuminated niches were displaying. Alina told her about the botanical collection and gave her the name of the nursery where she sourced specimen plants. The woman came back the following Saturday. Alina gave her a 40-minute tour of the specimens, the collection philosophy, and the reference work they supported. The woman had been a botanist before she retired. She and Alina had been neighbors for 4 years and had never had this conversation, because the hedge had meant their back gardens faced each other behind privacy screens, and their shared interests had simply never surfaced. Alina told me about it that afternoon. She said the wall had made something visible that the hedge had kept private. I said, "Your specimens." She said, "My work, my collection. What I have been doing out here for 11 years. The hedge was private. The wall is not private. The wall is a display." I said, "Patricia Holden wanted your hedge removed." She said, "Yes. And what she has now is something that cannot be removed without heavy equipment, and will be visible to her every evening for as long as she chooses to live there." I said, "Is that satisfying?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to all considered questions. Then she said, "It is just," which is a different thing from satisfying, but it is the thing I was aiming for. The wall stands along the western property line at 36 inches of footing and 10 feet of height, with 12 illuminated botanical niches facing east toward Alina's garden, and a terracotta stucco face visible to the west where Patricia Holden's property lies. It has been there since that Saturday evening. It will be there for 30 years if maintained. Alina will maintain it, because Alina maintains everything she builds according to a plan and checks the plan against the result every year. The specimens will change with the seasons and with her reference work. The wall will not change. The wall is the thing that does not change.
That was the design intent from the beginning. From the moment she sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a sketch and said she wanted the consequence of what was done to her to be something more visible and more permanent than what was destroyed. It is accomplishing that. It will keep accomplishing it. Patricia Holden destroyed an 8-year hedge during pending court proceedings because she believed she had a closing window before the injunction could stop her. What she got instead was a 10-foot illuminated wall she will look at every evening for as long as she stays. Built by a woman who spent 11 years on the federal bench, thinking carefully about what consequences are meant to accomplish, and who brought that same precision to every decision she made after she left it. That is enough. That was always the point. If this story stayed with you, the idea that the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger, but preparation, documentation, and something permanent, drop a comment below. And if you want more stories like this one, you already know what to do.